two Environment Agency officers the same question and get two different answers, or worse, sometimes three different answers. A very high international profile. So there's a range of things you can achieve with policy. Restrictions on people. If there's no reason to add something to it, don't put it in. Generally, simple rules are easier to follow than more complicated rules. It took me about 5 minutes this morning to work out whether I needed to leave the card on the bed if I wanted the sheets changing or not. And actually, I can't remember what I did now, because I didn't realise what time it was and I was going to miss breakfast. So, you can put people out of jobs as well, or kill them, worst case. Exacerbate the digital divide. See, we're talking, and I realise this will be a lot of the focus, about import of illegal goods. Yeah? Nobody wants that to happen. But the key thing is providing a solution at the end of life. And it doesn't really matter if it's your brand new, just bought thing that's reached its end. Well, it would if it was under warranty. But the length of time to reach the end of life is irrelevant in the respect of the environment. What really happens is what you do at the end of life. So at the moment, if you have no infrastructure, it doesn't really matter if, just to wind Jean up, if it's a brand new Dell that broke and you can't be bothered to take it back to the shop, or if it's a fake Nokia from China. It doesn't really matter. The fact is you need to have something to do with it. So good policy can create an enabling framework. Bad policy can stop anything being done right. The other thing I would say is really important is to make sure that you make it harder to do the wrong thing than the right thing. We've had an issue, and it's changing now, but in the UK it was being often cheaper to do things wrong and pay the fine or the cost rather than doing it right. So doing it right actually costs more money. Well, you're not really going to persuade people to do the right thing if it's actually more expensive than doing the wrong thing. So make sure you hurt people, not physically, but usually financially. In the UK now, they're using the Proceeds of Crime Act. So basically what they're saying is that they'll take away your house and your car and everything for it if they think you've done it through illegal activity. One of my colleagues was saying how they were talking to folks, they were taking off your house where you can't. So I don't really care, I've got a yacht in the Mediterranean. They said, really? I'll record and fill it up. Okay. And he said, no, we've got a yacht. I don't think they get to keep it. It's hoping for a little trip. So what do you want to regulate? You can regulate all of it, or you could regulate none of it. I would suggest that what you try and do is focus on the few key areas. But some of these are absolutely vital. There's no point talking about regulating treatment and disposal if you don't have a collection system. But on the other hand, if you can come up with a model where you've got enough money coming in and you can pay people for materials, then that will have an impact. Talking about imported goods, you put the same requirement on imported goods that you do on domestic goods. There's no right or wrong, they're just different approaches. Except I would say the UK does seem to have gone down the road of, if in doubt, bring out a regulation, or a policy, or a guidance. It's not all consistent. I mean, this is a very small selection. And the other thing is, if you look at, say, for example, the WIG directive, you'll see that the last few updates have all been like a sheet. So we're about to have a big one, but they've all been a sheet. So you actually need all the previous ones. And from an academic point of view, it makes it a nightmare to reference, because you're never quite sure which one you need to reference to get the relevant pointing. But some of them are quite useful. I mean, the standard rules permit, I'm sure Rob's very familiar with, that says what you need to do to run your site, what makes it appropriate, what makes it run for you. There's codes of practice, and this isn't even going around the compliance schemes on how producers become responsible. I mean, for example, we have the guidance on best available treatment, recovery and recycling techniques. And you might say, oh, that'd be great. Except, is that really the most appropriate thing? I mean, if you're in a country with maybe not a very reliable power supply, but a big workforce, then it would seem silly to go for a technology that involves a lot of energy and very few people. So you need to make it clear what you'll accept, and so that importers and exporters understand. Do you want to repeat your quote, Professor Osvaldo? In Geneva one year we were talking about imports and exports and process. The trouble is, we have to understand this, and you have to excuse my language, it's different. He said if you'll take shit, they'll give you shit. So if you'll accept it, that's what you'll get. But you also need to be careful about when you're banning things, what you might be banning. So for example, again, we're talking about CRT. So you say we'll ban the import of CRT. The last few times I've been in hospitals, all the medical display devices are CRTs. A lot of scientific equipment is CRT because you get a better level of definition, so they tell me. So if you ban the import of CRTs, are you actually going to go retrograde in your healthcare provision? So it might seem like a minor thing, and this is where you've got to be very careful when you're developing policy and regulation, because a little thing can make a big difference. Though of course the advantage is that many of these policies and regulations go through lots of different changes, and that's what case law is all about, and that's why lawyers are usually quite rich. You need to look at the health, so protect the health of workers and protect public health as well. So nobody wants anyone to get off any worse. When we were doing, Professor Osvaldo and I were doing some training in Lagos, we were talking to the informal sector about cable burning. And they said they'd regularly been told not to burn cables, but nobody had ever told them what the impacts on their health were. And they said, now we know, we'll stop. And this is part of the thing about identifying your stakeholders. Don't just tell people to not do something or bring out a regulation that says don't do this. Explain why. And if you can't explain, perhaps you shouldn't have it in the regulations. If there's no reason for it, it's pointless. The environment, we need to, very hard to distinguish that from health, but protect soil, air and water. The economics, you need to have sustainable business models. Nobody's going to develop an infrastructure or a recycling system based on not knowing where the money's coming from. And I think you've covered a bit about economies of scale. And sometimes you might find that actually it's not appropriate to put something in your country, but it's more appropriate to work with other countries on a regional basis and put stuff there. Particularly for some of the, or even export, for some of the problematic fractions perhaps, or just really in most aspects of waste management, economies of scale are very important. The more you collect, the more it's worth, the easier it is to treat. And also, if you're looking at standards, make sure that your standards are equal. If you have standards that are too weak, you become a dumping ground. If you have standards that are too high, which is something we're often accused of in the UK, you get gold plating, and so businesses suffer. An example of this would be that most of our regulation now comes from Europe. Yeah? So we have a rule that if Rob, seeing as here, I'll use him as an example, wanted to make building bricks out of using CRT glass, leaded CRT glass, he wouldn't be allowed. But if he wants to send it to Holland, also part of the EU, they can make it into a brick and then export those bricks back to the UK. Now, I don't understand how that creates a level playing field and how that's fair. Because as far as I can see, it's disadvantaging UK businesses, and if it was that bad, they wouldn't be doing it in Holland, and we wouldn't then be able to import them back into our country. So be aware of how your stuff fits with other people. And I think that you may be at a significant advantage of having all of you in the same room at the same time trying to develop things, so you can identify those synergies of how things work. I mean, I know all the countries are very different, but there's also a lot of similarities as well. So, like I said, you need, I put the concise, everyone just says clear. But have you ever tried reading through? I mean, I mainly look at the UK legislation. There's some of it. You know, it's only good if you can't sleep. And it needs to be focused. Don't try and fit that extra feeling because you didn't really know where to put it. You know, it's better to have a small focused bit of regulation that sticks to exactly what you need to do, the one that's focused purely on how to breed cows, and then you weren't quite sure where to put goats, you put them in as well. Make a whole separate regulation for the goats, they'll be fine. You need to make sure that you've got this infrastructure and enforcement, because nobody's going to invest without knowing that the enforcement infrastructure is there. I'm not going to build a new recycling plant here to the standards I know I need to do if you're going to let someone else build another one where it doesn't really matter what they do. You know? It's very important, and pretty much every country that does this has some kind of permitting system. So sites and facilities are authorised and monitored. And if you're going to do that, you also need to make sure that the public, and I mean the public, so as part of your key stakeholders, are aware of that, so they know what's wrong if they take their stuff to there. So they should know that I have to take it to somewhere that's been authorised by NEMA or NESRA or the EPA. That it's actually no good to take it to that person down the road because he's still burning it, and frankly that's not helping anyone. People are trained, so I think that's an important level of enforcement training, but also stakeholder training. And I said before about standards being realistic and enforced. So there's a range of different other considerations. So the precautionary principle. So that would mean, just if you're not quite sure, make sure opt for the safer option. Self-sufficiency, which I think self-sufficiency and proximity principle is really what this whole thing is about. It's trying to develop solutions that work here for the waste that's coming from here. So that's very important. Polluter pays. That will link also, I suspect, to an element of producer. Duty of care is a very important concept. If it's my waste, I'm responsible for it till it's recovered or disposed of. Then, really, is there any point in bringing in a whole detailed regulation about it? I mean, we all have health and safety regulations. I swear I've cut myself more on paper than I have in any of the things where there's some health and safety aspect. But nobody regulates about paper cuts because it's not really going to do me any great damage. It does smart a bit, but apart from that, there's no great dramatic effect. Though if you want to see my scars later. So, need to cover the life cycle of the USD, no matter where it was generated from. So ideally, I imagine that the governments of the various nations represented here would like all their computers and other electronic equipment to be generated within the country. So basically, you could imagine a thing where Africa imports, takes all the scarce materials out, and then can manufacture from them and generate their own indigenous industry. Still needs some end-of-life solution, whether it's brand new from China, brand new from Nigeria, or second-hand, or brand new from the UK, USA, wherever. And you need to make sure that you've looked at all the aspects of it. Collection. Collection can have an impact. We saw down, I was going to say down at the port, but we're still at the port. When we were walking around the yard, I mean, several of us were looking at a computer, and they were saying, no, it wasn't damaged when we got it, we just dropped it. So collection and storage can have an issue, because most electronic equipment isn't hazardous in itself. It's only when you start breaking it up and mixing it with other stuff, because otherwise we'd be a bit more wary of using it. So dismantling and segregation, recycling, treatment and disposal. So this is some of the stuff Matthias talked about earlier. And the level of regulation being appropriate to the level of risk. But also, any policy or regulation you develop can't be in isolation. It needs to link with other things. So I know there have been issues in some countries about recovering the metals, and then that country having regulations that restrict the export of metals. Well, you need to make sure that the environment you're dealing in facilitates what you're trying to achieve. We're familiar with exporting hazardous fractions, but sometimes the hazardous fraction has to be exported. I mean, within Europe, there are very few specialist hazardous waste or precious metal recovery places. So you would expect within Africa there to be very few, even when your infrastructure is perfectly well established. So be aware that sometimes you'll need to move things and you can't deal with everything just on your doorstep. And this goes back to the whole thing about economies of scale. I would say for effective policy and regulation, it should either protect health, public, worker, whatever, protect the environment, or allow you to check whether that's being done correctly. And I would argue that if it doesn't do any of those things, you should seriously consider whether it should be there or not. Because they're the key aspects. There might be something about ensuring the economy or the business sustainability, but it should be done under those three frameworks, those three key facilities. And so when you're talking about that, what you need to do is you need to understand the roles, as I mentioned. So you've got all these key stakeholders with different roles, and understand the rationale and the consequences. So as a regulator, or as someone who's developing a policy or a regulation, you can say to them, they say, well, why do we have this rule? You can say, the reason you have this rule is if you do this, you'll have if you burn cables, you'll release dioxins. The dioxins can give you cancer, they can cause reproductive issues. The one that seems to highlight the effects of dioxins very well to people is to point out that Agent Orange, that the Americans sprayed in the Vietnam War that killed loads of people and deformed their children, that was mainly dioxin as its active ingredient. Explain to me why you do that. So why you have the regulation is then clear, and then have a consequence that is proportional. So you can say to them, if you carry on doing this, this will be what will happen. And make that not worth their risk to them. So there's a range of stages you go through. So you decide what you're trying to do. So you set the agenda, you look at what you're trying to do, how you're trying to take it forward. So create the market, then you develop a policy and see how you'll take this forward. So this will consist of identifying your stakeholders, what you're going to do for guidelines, handling rules, any other aspects. So you decide what that's going to do, and then you share that with the people it will affect. There obviously you can have in the policy formulation development, there can be a consultation element of that as well. But normally that will be a much more focused consultation. Then you move to the adoption and dissemination, so you work with people, you lobby support for it amongst your key stakeholders, and then you implement it. So you publish it, you see how it works, you feedback, and then you review, and then quite often the whole thing just keeps going forever. Because you review it, and as things develop, so your basic standard you start with, then actually they're outdated now because the best practice for e-waste management in Ghana is so much better than it was 5 years ago when you started. You can now up the ante, you can make it a bit more stringent, so you can improve on it constantly. So just going to go through a few examples of some bits of mainly permit conditions, and I'm going to focus on the UK and Nigeria, mainly because they're the regulations I know the best. So the Nigerian regulations actually fit very well with some of the basic export guidelines for the UK. You can pretty much guarantee it isn't waste, it is something that's fit for reuse. And Wesley and Federico have a few copies of that, I think, if people want them. Which were, I should say, because I promised I would, kindly donated by the British Standards Institute of the UK. And very heavy, which is why I folded them off there quite quickly. So another condition, we'll be looking at air pollution. So in the UK, the regulations say that weed treatment must be carried out inside a building, and that you can't burn any waste. You can't burn them in the open, in the building, or in any kind of incinerator. In Nigeria, the regulations say open burning is prohibited, and it says every operational facility shall not burn e-waste in the Nigerian environment, and it specifies that if you do that, it will be an offence. It does also specify what the penalty will be, but I didn't repeat that. Also, one of our Nigerian colleagues will have. Storage of water. So again, one of the things, treatment and storage of waste should be carried out in a building. Of course, this is important in the UK and in Nigeria because of the level of rainfall. If you're talking about a country where there is virtually no rain, like in some parts of Brazil, for example, probably less worried about things leaching from rainfall, but not necessarily. So it needs to be on an impermeable surface, so if any liquid comes into contact with it, it's not going to leach any chemicals into the soil. You should have protection for spillage, and it should be that if there is any liquid that comes into contact with it, it can be correctly treated and collected, or even collected and treated. In Nigeria, it says they shouldn't be exposed to sunlight. See, that's not worry in the UK, or any other sources of heat. See, I wish I was joking, but you should be there the last few weeks. All it's done is just rain. As my sister said, it hasn't even taken a breath. It just kept going. Floor is tiled. I do slightly disagree with this bit, because tiling doesn't necessarily mean it's impermeable, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not either. And the ambient temperature is not exceeded. Again, monitoring. An AATF is an approved authorised treatment facility, so it's someone who has the permit to say they can do it. Needs to keep records for each quarter and needs to keep them for at least 4 years. Nigeria says you must keep records and you need to keep them for 5 years. Right, fair enough. But you'll see that if you actually look through most of these regulations, there's a very standard format for them. They all carry the same sort of things. And I would suggest that anyone who's looking to start something like this doesn't start from scratch, because there's no real point. What you want to do is learn from the best practice and take the stuff you need. So just an outline. Usually you've got the background, which gives any reasons or history, and that's quite often important when you're trying to evaluate it to see how well it's worked. Is it serving the purpose you brought it out for? The statement saying what you're hoping to get at the end of it. The applicability and scope, so who's included by it and who's not. I'll cover the definition of producer. E-waste. Now personally, I don't think it really matters much if you've sold as a business 10,000 computers or you've given 10,000 computers as a charity. You're still the importer, and I think you should take into account the full life cycle of what you're trying to do. If I drop a brick outside my hotel window, just because I didn't really think to look below it, doesn't really matter if it hits you on the head. And I think you need to take into account, are you going to sanction? Guidelines have a similar structure but tend to have a lot more detail into what's actually going to include. But you want to be careful when you're doing this not to include specific technologies, because they'll vary considerably depending on the circumstances you're talking about. I said the importance of definitions. In the UK, in the EU, we've got a complete hang-up on the definition of waste. We run a degree in waste management and we do an MSc in waste management, and I think you could probably do either of those into what is the definition of waste. Problematic fraction is also an issue, but the one I'm going to focus on, because it's the one I understand the best, and if I don't understand, I've got enough people who can help me out in this room, is the definition of producer. And the reason producer is often an issue is because if you look around all of these computers, you can tell who produced it or who manufactured it, and we tend to use the words interchangeably. Yeah? Did you produce it? Did you manufacture it? But a manufacturer isn't necessarily a producer. So if I'm Apple, if I was that rich, sorry. I just suddenly started thinking if I was that rich. I might not actually sell anything onto the market here at all. I might have sold it to someone else. So why is that my responsibility? So you need to make sure you're clear who someone is, so those responsibilities of those stakeholders can be addressed. So I think a nice working definition of a producer is the local manufacturer or importer of new and used placed it on the market to be placed on a country market at first invoice by sale. So it's who brought it into the country. So in other words, who made the money for bringing it into the country. And it needs to be very important that it works for both new and used E. Because as I said, at the end of life, that's when the issue becomes. It doesn't necessarily matter where it's come from originally. And I know in some places this has been caused a lot of debate, and it's thought that the importers will not be very keen on this. But I've also heard stories that importers in some countries are really ready for this, that they see it as a role. Because the original equipment manufacturer, so the OEM, might not actually be present there. And you can bring in a guideline in Kenya and that says, right, anything with Dell written on it, Dell will recycle. And Dell will go, we're not based in Kenya. So there's absolutely nothing you can do. So what you need to do is look at who based it in Kenya, who brought it into your country. So it's very important that when you're looking at roles and responsibilities and definitions, that you know who's going to do what, and that you're clear that not only they should be doing it, but that you have some way of enforcing that on them. You can issue enforcement notices or works notices, so something needs to be improving. You can tell people to stop doing things. You can stop their environmental permit. You can vary their permit. Or even better, what you can then do is take everything they own and put them in prison. That tends to be a very effective one, but usually a last case scenario. In the UK at the moment, we've now brought in civil sanctions, but I haven't really worked out, to be honest, what impact they're having. So we've all seen these pictures, this sort of thing, and everybody sort of assumes that that is e-waste in Africa. But there's absolutely no reason why e-waste in Africa can't look like that. It just all depends on how you deal with it and how you regulate it.